The first sound was the gate. A slow groan of wood and iron, dragging against its hinges. Then came the light, harsh, white, and merciless, pouring into the corridor like a punishment. Dust floated in the beam, catching the glow of torches held by trembling hands. And beyond it, the roar. Not the roar of beasts. Not yet. The roar of Rome. The amphitheater breathed like a living thing. 100,000 voices pressed together in hunger. The air quivered with their anticipation. Men jostled for sightlines. Women lifted their veils to glimpse what was to come. Even the children, faces painted in crimson and gold, had come to learn the shape of death. Beneath their feet, the gladiators waited. Chains clinked softly in the half-dark, and the stench of sweat, fear, and rusted steel choked the tunnels. Some prayed to Mars. Others whispered the names of lost mothers. They were soldiers of entertainment, chosen not for faith or freedom, but for spectacle. The sand above them was their stage. The first man to step into the light was not a gladiator, but a condemned thief. His name is lost to history, as all such names are. But the record tells of his crime. He stole bread from a temple kitchen. The crowd did not care what he had done. They cared only for how he would die. A trumpet sounded. A hush fell. And then the beast emerged. A lion, brought from the deserts of Numidia, ribs protruding like the bones of a shipwreck. Starved for 3 days. Its eyes were wet and gold, its mane matted with dirt. The animal paused, inhaling the scent of man and fear. Then it moved. The thief fell to his knees. He called out to the gods, but the gods had long been spectators here. When the lion struck, the sound was not of violence, it was of inevitability. The crowd erupted, spilling their approval like thunder. Flowers were thrown from the upper galleries. Coins rained down for the men who had arranged the scene. And in that chorus of applause, something in Rome's soul shifted. It was no longer a ritual. It was a performance. When the last breath left the thief's chest, slaves rushed forward to drag the body away. Others shoveled fresh sand over the blood, smoothing the earth as though preparing it for another story. And indeed, another would follow. Always another. In the imperial box sat Augustus, calm, inscrutable, wrapped in silk the color of bone. He did not smile, nor frown. His stillness was more terrifying than the lion's hunger. Around him, senators whispered, wives watched through jeweled masks, and scribes recorded the day's deaths as public record. Rome had found its altar. And the god it worshipped was spectacle. At first, these games were acts of remembrance. Munera, they called them, a duty to honor the dead through combat. But what began as tribute became addiction. The crowd's appetite grew restless. 2 men fighting to the death was not enough. They wanted stories, myths performed in flesh, punishments dressed as parables. The architects obeyed. The producers of death invented roles. Criminals became characters. The condemned were transformed into actors in tragedies they could not survive. A man was made to play Orpheus, strumming a lyre until a bear tore him apart. Another became Icarus, flung from a wooden tower on wax wings that melted in the heat of torches. They called it art. In these perversions of legend, Rome revealed its truest nature, not savage, but theatrical. Every death was staged, choreographed, and rehearsed. The cruelty was not chaos. It was design. The crowd adored it. They came not to see justice, but perfection. The perfection of fear. The precision of pain. By midday, the amphitheater's floor was streaked with blood so dark it looked like shadow. The air shimmered with heat. The scent of iron mixed with perfume, and the laughter of the wealthy echoed over the dying. One historian would later write that the games united Rome. He was right, but not in virtue. The games bound the empire in shared corruption, a communion of cruelty. For a few hours, slave and senator, patrician and beggar, all were equal in their hunger. And yet, beneath the glory, something sinister grew. Among the spectators was a woman named Livia Drusilla, the emperor's wife. Her gaze lingered not on the victims, but on the faces of the crowd, their ecstasy, their detachment. She saw what her husband could not, that this was not peace, but anesthesia. Rome's violence had simply learned how to disguise itself as order. Later that evening, when the arena emptied and the slaves claimed the remains, she stood at the balcony overlooking the sand. The torches flickered in the wind, and for a moment, the stains looked almost like art, patterns of sacrifice beneath the stars. Somewhere below, a gladiator sang softly in his cell, a melody from a forgotten province. It was the sound of someone remembering humanity in a place that had none. The next morning, the games would continue. There were thousands waiting for their turn, to fight, to die, to amuse. And above them, Rome would watch. The Colosseum had not yet been built, but the spirit of it was already alive. The idea that power could be measured in screams. That civilization required witnesses to cruelty. That beauty could exist in suffering, if one only looked from a high enough seat. They would build theaters from that idea. They would immortalize it in stone. But for now, it lived in sand and shadow. The gate creaked again. Another man stepped forward, his hands bound, his eyes hollow with waiting. The crowd began to chant, 3 syllables, rising like prayer, falling like judgment. It was not his name. It was a demand. Spectaculum. A spectacle. And so it began again. The roar swallowed the morning sun. The sand shivered beneath the hooves of beasts. And high above, Augustus closed his eyes, not in pity, but in contemplation. Because in that roar, he heard the sound of Rome's true heart beating, slow, steady, and hungry. A heart that would not stop until the last human voice in the arena fell silent. But that silence was still far away. And before it came, the empire would learn how deep its hunger could go. The games had only just begun. By the time Nero took the throne, Rome had already mastered the art of death. But under his reign, the spectacle became something else, no longer just punishment or power, but performance. What had once been ritual now demanded imagination. The arena became a theater of flesh, and the human body its canvas. At dawn, the Colosseum's gates opened like the mouth of a god. The citizens of Rome streamed in, not as mourners or witnesses, but as devotees of spectacle. Vendors shouted the price of wine, perfume mingled with the stench of blood, and sunlight fell upon the sand like a spotlight. Beneath that blinding light, the condemned waited. Among them was a woman known to the record only as Emilia, a former dancer, accused of adultery with a senator. Her beauty, they said, rivaled Venus. But beauty, in Rome, was a weapon that could wound the wrong man. For that, she would die as myth reborn. The heralds announced the act, the punishment of Pasiphae. The crowd murmured, some in shock, some in anticipation. They knew the tale. The queen who lay with a bull, whose desire birthed the Minotaur. It was not enough that Emilia die, she must die as a symbol of perversion itself. They brought out the wooden cow, a hollow frame of polished oak, carved with a woman's face and gilded eyes. Inside, Emilia was bound, her body hidden, her voice echoing through the slits in the wood. The bull was led forth, massive, snorting, its hide glistening with oil. The priest sprinkled the sand with wine. The emperor leaned forward. When the bull struck, the crowd gasped, not from pity, but from fascination. The sound was like thunder breaking through marble. The structure splintered, and Emilia's cry merged with the roar of the animal. It was theater, grotesque and divine, where myth and execution became indistinguishable. When it ended, the people applauded. Coins clattered onto the blood-soaked sand. Emilia's name would never be spoken again, but her death had entertained the empire. That was all Rome required. Not far from the imperial box sat Petronius, Nero's courtier and reluctant witness. Known as Arbiter Elegantiae, the judge of taste, he had designed many of these spectacles. To him, art and cruelty were siblings born of the same mother. Yet as he watched, even he could not hide his unease. The emperor smiled. His lips barely moved, but the gesture froze Petronius's breath. Nero's face was powdered white, his eyes lined in kohl, his robe stitched with amethyst thread. He looked less like a man than a deity sculpted in decay. He turned to his advisor and whispered, "They love what they fear. That is how gods are made." Petronius bowed, though something in his soul recoiled. He had seen what happened to those who questioned the theater of Rome. The next act began. Dozens of men, prisoners of war from the east, were paraded into the arena dressed as hunters. Behind them, cages opened, tigers, bears, leopards starved to madness. It was not combat, but choreography. Every movement was rehearsed. Every scream timed to the trumpet's cry. The beasts were the orchestra. The condemned were the instruments. When one man fell, a leopard tore his throat open with such speed that the crowd gasped in admiration. It was not death they saw, it was elegance. High above, Nero reclined on silk cushions. He plucked grapes from a silver dish and laughed softly at the rhythm of slaughter. To him, the arena was not a pit of horror but a living poem, a hymn written in agony and applause. He believed it reflected the divine truth of rule, that power must not only be held, but displayed. Petronius watched him with quiet terror. He saw the transformation of empire into theater, emperor into performer, humanity into script. Rome had begun to believe its own illusions, that cruelty, when gilded with beauty, was virtue. By mid-afternoon, the sun had turned the marble seats into furnaces. The air shimmered with heat, and the sand burned beneath the victims' feet. Yet the crowd remained, intoxicated. The scent of roasting meat drifted from the arena floor as bodies were burned for the finale, a scent that mingled disturbingly with incense from the altars above. The final performance was called the Triumph of Diana. A group of condemned women were dressed as nymphs and chained to wooden posts. Archers, disguised as gods, were ordered to shoot them one by one. Nero himself loosed the first arrow. It pierced a woman's throat, and as blood sprayed the sand, the crowd cheered his aim. The emperor rose, arms wide, basking in the devotion. He was not a ruler now, but a high priest of spectacle, offering humanity to the altar of Rome's appetite. Petronius could not look away. His hands trembled. He saw, in that moment, the truth he had long denied, that the empire's splendor was only the mask over its sickness. Behind the marble, the gold, and the music, there was only hunger. As the smoke drifted upward, he thought of the philosopher Seneca, Nero's tutor, now disgraced and waiting for death. Seneca had once written that cruelty poisons the soul that practices it. Petronius wondered if Rome had already been poisoned beyond salvation. The games ended at dusk. The crowd departed singing, drunk on violence and wine. The sand was raked smooth again, ready for the next day's executions. Nothing remained of Emilia, or the nymphs, or the hunters. Only fragments of costume, flecks of bone, the echo of applause. Nero retired to his palace that evening, where mirrors lined the walls and musicians played soft hymns. He looked into his reflection and saw not a man, but a legend in the making. Behind him, the windows flickered with the glow of torches from the still-smoking arena. Petronius lingered at the threshold, unable to step inside. He thought of the crowd, their cheers, their faces lit with ecstasy, and understood that they were not victims of tyranny. They were participants. Worshippers at the altar of power. He turned away, the night wind heavy with ash. Somewhere beyond the hills, the Tiber whispered against its banks, carrying the scent of decay toward the sea. Tomorrow, the gates would open again. New myths would be written in flesh. And the theater of Rome would continue, its audience ever faithful, its actors ever dying. The empire had found the one art it would never abandon. The art of turning suffering into spectacle. The games were no longer about blood. They were about belief. And belief, once corrupted, could outlive any empire. The morning began with silence, a rare thing in Rome. No merchants shouted. No bells rang from the forum. Even the wind seemed to pause outside the Colosseum's towering arches. It was as if the city itself held its breath, waiting for him. Commodus, son of Marcus Aurelius. Born of a philosopher, but bred for theater. He called himself Hercules reborn, the god made flesh. And like a god, he demanded proof of his divinity, proof written in blood. When he stepped into the arena, the crowd erupted in thunderous devotion. Their emperor wore a lion's skin draped across his shoulders, a polished club in one hand, a gilded sword in the other. His muscles gleamed with oil. Around his neck hung amulets carved with the faces of conquered nations. He smiled, not with warmth, but with the satisfaction of a child who knows no limits. To the people, this was not madness. It was glory. Their emperor was not hidden behind palace walls, he was here, in the dust, sharing their appetite. The games that day were not meant to entertain, they were meant to worship. 100 gladiators stood ready, handpicked to die for his legend. None could refuse. Refusal was treason. Survival, an insult. The arena's sand glowed red by midday. Commodus struck down the maimed and the weak, posing after each kill as though painted for eternity. He spared none. Even the dying were forced to crawl toward him for the final blow, kissing his feet before the sword fell. He called it mercy. But his cruelty was not only an action, it was an invention. He designed deaths like an artist. Dwarfs dressed as monsters. Women forced to fight beasts while bound in gold chains. He slaughtered exotic animals brought from Africa, not because they threatened him, but because they flattered his myth. When he decapitated an ostrich, he held up the severed head and gestured mockingly toward the senators in the front row. They laughed, hollow and terrified. Every cheer, every smile was a survival strategy. Rome had learned how to disguise fear as admiration. From his seat in the shadows, Cassius Dio, a historian and senator, watched with clenched hands. He had written of the empire's greatness, of its philosophy and order. But now he saw what it had become, an empire enslaved to its own reflection. He noted every act, every cruelty, with the quiet precision of a man documenting a disease. Later, he would write, the arena was Rome's true heart, and its pulse was madness. Commodus fought until his arms ached. When his attendants urged him to stop, he struck one down for impertinence. Blood stained his sandals, and he laughed. The laughter echoed through the colonnades, rising higher than the cries of the dying. He ordered a final show. From the gate emerged a group of prisoners, men who had conspired against him, accused of plotting his death. Their crime was imagination. Commodus would grant them one last performance, a reenactment of the labors of Hercules. But the hero this time was him. He faced them in the arena alone, or so he wanted it to appear. Hidden archers stood ready in the shadows. When the prisoners charged, they fell before reaching him, arrows piercing their chests mid-stride. Commodus raised his arms to the sky, pretending to thank the gods for victory. The crowd roared, blind to deceit. For him, this was perfection. A play with death as its instrument, and himself as its immortal lead. From the imperial box, Marcia, his mistress, watched in silence. Once adored, now wary. She had seen how quickly affection could become accusation. The man she had loved was vanishing behind the mask of a god. His eyes no longer saw faces, only roles, victims, worshippers, betrayers. When the final prisoner fell, the trumpets sounded triumph. Commodus stood at the center of the arena, drenched in sweat and dust, arms spread like wings. The image was meant to endure, the emperor as eternal, invincible. But for those who watched closely, the illusion was already cracking. His voice trembled. His breath came shallow. Even gods can tire of pretending. As the day ended, he ordered feasts to celebrate his divine performance. The senators dined in terror, offering praise with shaking hands. Cassius Dio wrote that their laughter sounded like chains clinking in the dark. Later that night, Marcia approached him in his private baths. The steam blurred his reflection across the marble. She spoke softly, warning him that the people were restless, that his games had become nightmares whispered through the city. He waved her words away. They love me, he said, because I remind them what power looks like. She smiled faintly, though her heart had turned to stone. She knew power when it began to decay, it smelled of roses rotting in the heat. Outside, the Colosseum slept, its sand crusted with the blood of the day. In the silence, the ghosts of the slain seemed to murmur beneath the stone. Their whispers rose like breath from the earth, unheard, unheeded. Commodus believed he had inherited Rome's eternity. But Rome was already crumbling from within. The games that once unified its people now divided them, those who cheered, and those who secretly prayed for their emperor's fall. Cassius Dio would later write that on nights like this, the city felt cursed. The gods had withdrawn, he said, and in their absence, men began to worship themselves. Marcia left the baths with a secret trembling behind her eyes. She had seen too much, too many bodies, too many lies. She knew the empire would not survive another god-king. By dawn, she would act. But for now, the emperor slept beneath gold ceilings, dreaming of applause that would never end. And outside, Rome waited, its stones heavy with silence, its people starved for redemption. The games had given them gods to worship. But soon, they would remember what it meant to destroy one. By the late 2nd century, the Roman arena had become less a theater of valor and more a temple to spectacle, a mirror reflecting the darkest hunger of a civilization that could no longer feel. The emperors had changed, but the ritual remained. Blood for loyalty. Pain for peace. Suffering for applause. The crowds no longer came for combat, they came for invention. Violence had to evolve to keep their faith. The sand could no longer simply drink blood, it had to display imagination. And so the arena became a laboratory of cruelty. Beneath the marble seats of the Colosseum, engineers labored like priests of a new religion, crafting devices to surprise and horrify. They called them machini, machines of spectacle, collapsible floors, spring-loaded beasts, cages that rose like ghosts from below the earth. The people would gasp, then laugh. And as they did, the soul of Rome rotted a little deeper. In one account, recorded by the historian Cassius Dio, Emperor Commodus, the so-called son of Hercules, stepped into the arena dressed not as ruler, but as performer. The crowd trembled, not from admiration, but from fear. No one could leave, the emperor's amusement was law. He slew beasts that had been crippled beforehand, striking from a distance to preserve his divinity. Then he ordered living men, amputees, convicts, those too weak to resist, to be dressed as mythic monsters. He would slay them theatrically, proclaiming that he had killed the giants of old. Each scream that rose from the pit was not protest, but performance. Each death, a line in the emperor's grotesque poem. And the people clapped. To the senators, this was madness. To the mob, it was communion. The boundaries between theater and execution dissolved, cruelty became the empire's art form. The Roman people had learned to confuse mercy with weakness and entertainment with empire. Later emperors would refine the ritual, making it more polished, less human. Exotic animals were imported from Africa and the East, lions, elephants, panthers, not for reverence, but for variety. A man might be torn apart by a bear, while across the arena another was devoured by serpents. Women were not excluded either. Condemned female slaves were made to reenact myths of divine punishment, Dirce, Pusiphi, Danae, their suffering choreographed to mimic the sins of gods and mortals. The Romans called it venatio, the hunt, but it was not the beasts who were hunted. It was humanity itself. Under the scorching noon sun, the sand shimmered like liquid bronze. The crowd shifted restlessly, hungry for novelty. Trumpets blared, gates opened, and from the darkness beneath emerged not warriors, but prisoners, trembling, nameless, waiting for a mercy that would never come. Their crimes were irrelevant. Treason, theft, or simply existing at the wrong moment, all fed the same appetite. And still, the games were said to be holy. Dedicating each slaughter to the gods made the people believe their cruelty was sanctified. Justice, they called it. But justice had long since bled away beneath those stones. What remained was ritual, a performance of power, a cycle of fear disguised as faith. At night, when the torches dimmed and the sands cooled, slaves swept the remnants of the day into wooden carts. Bits of bone, torn cloth, the coins and petals that had fallen from the stands. Silence would settle briefly, until dawn called the crowds again. Some chroniclers tried to rationalize it. They said the games kept peace, that violence inside the arena prevented rebellion outside it. But that was the cruelest illusion of all. A society that finds its unity in pain is already disintegrating. And so Rome continued, century after century, until the laughter grew quieter, the cheers more hollow. The people still came, but their eyes no longer shone. Even they could sense it, something sacred had been traded for something sick. When Christianity began to rise, its followers refused to attend the games. They called them desecrations of the divine image. For that defiance, they too were thrown to the beasts. Their faith was tested not in temples, but before the crowd. And yet, their silence, the refusal to scream, the refusal to perform, broke the spell. The audience could no longer ignore what they were watching. They saw, at last, not spectacle, but sacrifice. The empire's power depended on belief, the belief that its cruelty was necessary, that its spectacles made sense. When that belief cracked, Rome began to crumble. The last games were held in the 5th century. The Colosseum fell silent, its sands hardening into dust. Today, tourists walk where emperors once sat. Children take pictures where children once cried. The marble is chipped, the seats half buried, but beneath the ruin, the silence still hums. It is not peace, but memory. The Romans built their eternity on the suffering of others. They called it civilization. Yet their greatest monuments are tombs, not triumphs. The echo of their applause is gone, but the lesson remains. Power that feeds on pain is never immortal. And somewhere beneath that ancient stone, the cries of the nameless still rise, not in sound, but in spirit, reminding us that every empire which turns cruelty into art will, in time, become its own exhibit.